So then we'll go ahead and start with our introducing our hosts for this presentation, Endaf and Patrick. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
So I'm Endaf. I'm the CARA board member at large, so I can't disclose my location right now because I'm on the run. And I've been a member of CARA since 2008. And I've done the odd satellite pass, so I'm lucky enough to have worked a satellite a couple of times. So over to you, Patrick.
Couple of times? Oh, you're going to get called out for that one. I'm Patrick, WD9EWK. My original call sign from the mid-70s when my father was based at Great Lakes outside of Chicago, finishing up his Navy career. You know, I've done HF and other facets of amateur radio, but living in apartments and HOA controlled areas, satellite operating, especially with the portable gear we have now, that's been what I've done most in recent years. I still do some HF on field days or the portable HF out in the yard, but I enjoy being able to take my station with me, you know, just about anywhere I travel. And you know, what Endaf's not saying is he does a similar thing too. We both prop up the oil industry with some of our road trips. And I do want to thank Endaf and everyone here for the opportunity to speak this morning and to give a presentation about satellite operating, and we'll go more, you know, we'll be able to talk more than just how to get started, but I'll also have some examples of things that Endaf and I have done in operating from different places.
That sounds great. All right,
so I guess now, you know, ready for us to start?
Yes. So go ahead and share away.
Let me share screen.
And Roger, while Patrick's doing that, is that Kathy off of your shoulder?
That was Kathy, yes.
Oh,
Yes,
all right.
it disappeared now somewhere else in the part of the apartment, but she did come and have a look to see what was going on. I had to unplug my headphones so she could hear. Yep.
Okay, can everybody see my screen, which is right now, it should just be the club logo with today's date?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I did borrow that off either your Facebook page or your website to try to, you know, include that in the slideshow. But like I said, none of this information is proprietary, and I'll make sure, at least through Endaf, that I get the slideshow off to you done here this morning. Now I've got
no state secrets.
No state secrets. This is all open information. You know, much of what I talk about you can find on the internet, but you could be spending a lot of time, you know, finding information, then trying to determine, is this information correct? There's old information that may have been relevant years ago, but not today. But we're going to try to keep focus on where we are today and not go into a deep history lesson. The closest thing to a history lesson I'll offer is probably right here. You know, in the past, you know, we've had amateur radio satellites since the early 1960s. Oscar 1 was launched in 1961 from Vandenberg, up the road from many of you. But in the past, you usually needed multiple radios, separate transmitter and receiver, to work the satellites. And when you got into the 80s, there were the first satellite-ready transceivers. I'm thinking like the Yaesu FT726 and 736. Kenwood had a TS790. They weren't cheap. You know, most of the operating back then was single sideband or CW. We hadn't gotten to FM satellites in the 70s and 80s, but we did have satellites in high and low orbits. You I'll let Albert take care of those.
Yeah,
But there was
please.
really
I'll do it, sorry.
no easy or inexpensive way to get started. Because I looked in like late 80s, early 90s. I think I had priced it out. I would have needed to spend about $2,000 to $3,000 to get a station capable of working the satellites we had then. And at that point, I was still in college. And if I had $2,000 or $3,000, it was on a car, not on a bunch of radio gear. But like any other facet of ham radio, there's wallpaper, there are awards that you could work toward. Worked all states, VUCC, DXCC, just like on terrestrial modes or on HF. But today, we have many more options for radios, all mode radios, better satellite ready radios, software defined receivers, and in some cases transceivers. And as much as these radios get a bad reputation among ham operators, even these $20, $25, $30 Baofeng radios are an option for some. They are cheap. Our satellites, except for QO100 over Europe and Africa and the Middle East, our satellites are in lower orbits. But we also still have the awards like Worked All
Power
State
on.
and VUCC
Bluetooth
and
mode.
for some DXCC. I'm not looking at the chat window, Albert. Are there any questions or comments? We can field questions as we go on.
I'll keep an eye on it and I'll raise the questions. But I'm just saying good morning to them since we've already gone through the introductions.
Okay.
And so just sorry about that. Yeah.
That's all right. Thank you. In terms of satellite stations, it doesn't take much to get started. Usually a handheld dual band radio and some sort of antenna is enough to get started. These two pictures, include this, Wuxon or Oshang KG UV9D. It's a dual band handheld radio. And this is a long rubber ducky by MFJ. It's just like similar antennas from Comet and Diamond. And, one morning I went outside and AO91 was passing overhead, and I used this combination to make some contacts. You can see in the pictures, there's an earphone. This particular Wuxon radio is capable of full duplex operation where I can hear the satellite while transmitting, and a recorder, since I don't try to write anything down when I operate, and I try not to rely on my memory for more than maybe 1 or 2 call signs in a pass. So I just record everything and then play it back later to update my log. It's a simple setup, not exactly the best way to start out, but there are people who do this as their starting point. For other people, that Baofeng radio I just showed, the red radio in the picture is a variant of the UV5R, along with a homemade version of the Aero dual band Yagi, a 2 meter and 70 centimeter antenna, popular among satellite operators. The antenna was built by a ham in southern Mexico. He bought the Baofeng. I think in Mexico, they run the equivalent of 50 to 60 US dollars. So a little more expensive than here in the US, but he built the antenna to cut down on his costs and had a workable station for the FM satellites. Another option. This is probably a better option than my first picture with the handheld and the flexible ducky antenna. I was using this Kenwood THD72 dual band. This radio also has packet and APRS functionality built into it, along with an ELK dual band log periodic for 2 meters and 70 centimeters. And this was actually a demonstration I was doing at the Hamfest in Yuma a couple years ago. I just stepped outside the vendor hall and I hooked up my radio antenna and I put a loudspeaker off the speaker jack back to where the photographer was for this picture so that the crowd could hear the satellite downlink. and I could hear it too without any audio feedback as I transmitted. Again, very simple setup. Many people, this is as far as they would want to go with satellites. They're not looking to build a station at home or get into anything more than FM, but another viable station to get started on satellites. When it comes to the satellites, we have a few that are actually compatible with FM equipment. Here, this slide shows 4 of them. AO27 is approaching 30 years old, still operational, although it's difficult for the continental US because of its schedule. AO91 is probably still the popular one of the group because of its higher orbit than some of the other satellites. And by the way, AO91, this is a full-size model I'm holding of it. It's a 4-inch cube. Its antennas are a 6-inch wire off one face and a 19-inch wire off the other to handle both 2 meters and 70 centimeters. And all the faces have solar panels on it. This is not a functioning model, but it is other than the lack of antennas, is an accurate model of what the actual satellite looks like. AO91 and AO92 is basically a twin. It's had more problems with its batteries and it's not operational nearly as much. IO86, I listed this, even though in California and Arizona, you'll probably never have a chance to hear this because its orbit tracks the equator closely. So if you go to South Texas or South Florida, you would be able to hear this satellite on occasion. But the further north you are, if you're basically north of Orlando or maybe San Antonio in Texas, you'll probably not hear that satellite. But the other 3, if they're on, are certainly usable here in Arizona and over there in California. And we have a few others. Right now, the International Space Station's voice repeater is operational. It alternates between the repeater and a packet digipeater, but right now it's doing FM voice. Lilac Sat 2 used to have a schedule, but now it's pretty much on, not really randomly. Somebody turns it on, but you almost have to go outside and listen for it in the late afternoons. PO101 was built by a university in the Philippines. Originally, we only got to use it once or twice a week on its schedule, but now it's scheduled to operate virtually every day, day and night. SO50, that's been in operation almost 20 years. It uses PL tones to talk through the satellite and also to turn it on if it's not already operating. Many in the West have to turn SO50 on with the 74.4 hertz tone because it's coming over the Pacific where nobody was using it. And UVSQ Sat, that was launched a little over a year ago. It was built by a group in France, and it's actually operational today. It's only turned on like every few weeks in the FM repeater mode, but I made sure to list it in here because it's actually on today for, they turn it on in 11 or 12-hour increments, so it's usable worldwide. I don't know when it'll be turned on again, but it's it's on right now. So we have a fair number of satellites you can use with FM gear, and I'm not even talking about others that you need single sideband equipment or digital modes to make use of. When are these satellites available? There are websites, Heavens Above or the N2YO website are good references. N2YO's website in particular tries to determine your location, based on where you're connecting on the internet, but sometimes it's not so accurate. So you can put in your latitude and longitude or grid locator and it'll start showing when different satellites are available for you. You can also have apps on mobile phones or tablets. This is AMSAT Droid free on my Moto Android phone. It's a good one for the Android devices. ISS Detector, the Pro version in particular, is a good cross-platform one for both Android and the iOS devices. Endaf, are you're in the iPhone side. What are you using?
My app of choice is SatSat, SAT, SatSat.
Okay.
My app of choice, but also my secondary app is HamSat, which kind of gives you a kind of an image of the planet. I don't know if my camera's picking it up, but you can kind of spin it around. So those are my two apps that I mainly use: SatSat and HamSat, and that's iOS. I'm sure they're available on Android too, but I'm an iPhone guy.
Basically, whichever platform you're using for your phone or tablet, if you go to the appropriate app store and search for satellite tracking, there's a variety of apps available. Many are free. Some, like the pro version of ISS Detector, is $2 or $3. ISS Detector by itself, the free version, only tracks the International Space Station. The pro version adds in the ability to track other satellites, amateur radio satellites, weather satellites, and others. And there's a wide variety of software for different computer platforms. On the Windows side, SAT PC 32 is probably the more popular program for satellite operators. Some will use the satellite functions in Ham Radio Deluxe. Mac Doppler Pro is popular for the Mac crowd, and gPredict is an open source program that runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And again, searching online, there are other programs. Some people like the older programs like Nova for Windows because it makes nice maps. But the older programs can be hard to use on the modern operating systems. With the programmer app, with your radio, you're ready to go. In general, unlike on HF, if you don't hear anything from the satellite, don't transmit. Even though our satellites can be as small as these cubes, they have decent receivers, and they are listening sometimes with a footprint that covers coast to coast here in the continental US. So you might be transmitting on top of someone else if you just blindly push the PTT on your radio. The exception would be for SO50. If you don't hear that on, you probably should go ahead and transmit with the 74.4 hertz tone on its uplink to turn it on. And do open the squelch on the radios. Even the International Space Station repeater, it helps to have the squelch wide open to make sure you hear the downlink signals. They are readable, they're just not strong. For example, from AO91, this transmits at about 500 milliwatts, so roughly equivalent to low power on a handheld radio. The ISS transmits at 5 watts. Big difference when you're listening to them. If needed, make sure you engage the PL or CTCSS tone on the uplink, and be ready to twist your antenna. Unlike your repeater, like the repeaters your group has, the antennas on the satellite are not always vertical or horizontal. The satellites do tumble in their orbits, so at times the best way to receive the signal would be with an antenna that's oriented horizontally, or sometimes between horizontal and vertical. So in other words, just be ready to twist the antenna if you're holding it, or twist it in whatever mount it's on if that's possible, and you can keep up with the satellite signal that way. Unlike with a terrestrial repeater, they have to deal with the Doppler effect because we're dealing with signals coming from a moving object from the satellite. The frequencies do appear to change, even though I listed the nominal frequencies on those slides earlier. There is a small Doppler effect at 2 meters. It's roughly 3 kilohertz plus or minus. And in FM, you really don't see that. The FM receivers can compensate for a small amount of Doppler, but on the higher bands, the receivers need help, need the frequency adjusted. For example, at 70 centimeters, you're tuning across about 18 to 20 kilohertz during a 10 to 15 minute pass because of the Doppler effect. and a simple way to remember Doppler and which way to tune. If you're needing to make an adjustment, the uplinks you would tune upwards, and the downlinks you would tune downward. I didn't come up with that, but it is an easy way to keep that in mind. It's sort of like the train whistle analogy that many will use on how the train whistle changes as a train comes by you and then goes away from you. Except for the frequencies, here on the ground, if we're dealing with the uplink, we would just continue adjusting upward through a pass, or if we have to tune the downlink, we tune downward during the pass. And in terms of making satellite contacts, probably the best thing to do when you're starting out is just listen. I listened actually for a few months. I wanted to get an idea of how the operating is done on satellites, and it's not unlike working an HF contest or trying to work a D expedition in some rare location. It's rapid fire because of the low orbits and the limited amount of time per pass. But listen to the satellite, listen for call signs, listen for the stations that are actually making contacts. It's not necessary to call CQ. Chances are, if the satellite is on, even in the middle of the night, there might be someone else out there listening and just waiting to hear a station come through. But you can announce yourself. Probably the best way to get contacts if you're just starting out is, once you've listened and have recognized some call signs, call those stations. That way other people will hear you. They will hear that you're calling somebody else, so you were listening, and chances are the regular operators won't know won't recognize your call sign if you're just starting out. So the next thing you know, the stations will call you. You will be at the receiving end of the pileup just by showing up. If you're holding an antenna, or if it's on a tripod, be ready to move the antenna to track the satellite as it's crossing the sky. You've probably seen videos, and Endaf and I have videos where we've done this, where we may be pointing to the west at the start of a pass, and the end of the pass, we're facing east, or we've gone from north to south, or vice versa. But tracking the satellite with your antenna and twisting when necessary, you'll be able to keep the downlink signal in your radio. And if whenever possible, operate full duplex, where you can hear the satellite as you're transmitting, and you don't have to rely on hearing someone else call you. You'll know that you're already making it through the satellite. A big advantage over HF, where we do call CQ and hope someone answers us after our CQ calls. Logging. Satellite operators are like many other ham radio operators. We like to log our contacts. I did not mention the old way of just writing down call signs on a piece of paper. If you're holding the radio in one hand and the antennas in the other, that third or fourth hand would come in nicely to be able to write stuff down. But barring that, you can use an audio recorder or a recording app on your phone or tablet or on a computer. Some radios will record for you. You just have to activate the recording function. I use a little Sony recorder, so that way I just focus on the one station I'm trying to work and not worry about the 3 or 4 or however many other stations I've made a contact with, and then just go back to the recording after the fact to know who did I work, when were those contacts made, and then log them. Many logging programs will support satellite contacts. You might have to enable some additional fields on your entry screens to pick satellite name and to be able to specify, the bands or the frequencies you used for that satellite. Logbook of the World, QRZ, EQSL, other sites also handle satellite contacts, which can be useful and helpful if you're chasing awards. And satellite operators still like to send out QSL cards. Some people, that's part of their fun in working satellites, is they still like to exchange the cards, even if they've already put the contact in Logbook of the World or QRZ. They'll still send out cards, and some people will actually send out cards where they put together envelopes that have lots of old postage stamps. I'm trying to find one of those here. Some hams have gone out to those online shops that sell old stamps. And here's an envelope I got from a ham. This guy is in Florida. He's got a wide assortment of space themed stamps from, I think, from the late 50s, early 60s into the Apollo 15 times with that, standing on the moon with that stamp. But, you don't have to go to that extreme. And Endaf's got one of those too. It looks like from the same guy. Now there's a few guys out there who will use the old stamps, and sometimes they just get old postage stamps, that aren't space themed. But in any event,
I put Star Trek stamps on mine.
Oh, cool. At one time, when you could actually get the personalized stamps where you upload a picture to a website, you could get stamps printed out with whatever picture or image. I used to do that, but the post office stopped those, the photo stamp programs that, like stamps.com and a couple of others used to offer. Those went away in the last couple of years. I guess maybe they'll come back in the future, or maybe not. Before I go on, Albert, any questions we can address?
We don't have any questions in the chat, so let's see if anybody has any hands raised or anything else. I don't see. Oh, Joe has a question, hand raised, and then Tom next.
Okay, we can take those questions in, and we'll continue on.
Yeah, Patrick, this is Joe. You talked about satellite operators, and who is operating these satellites? Are they, universities or government states, or the guy next door? I mean, who's the operator?
Okay. Of the actual satellites. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, some of them were built by amateur radio organizations. AO91 and AO92 were built by AMSAT here in the U.S. Some of the other satellites are built by universities, around the world. We have some satellites that have been built by universities and groups in China. Many of them, the university projects are just like university projects here in the U.S. Students are wanting to learn about space and operating satellites in space. It's usually not government entities, although that was done in the past. Certainly during Soviet times, the RS or Radio Sputnik satellites, those projects were normally led by some function of the Soviet government. They may have involved university students or others, but it can be any number of options for who is actually building and launching the satellites. Now here in the U.S., even though AMSAT builds the satellites, there is a control operator designated who's ultimately responsible to turn the satellite off if it's causing interference. Most countries have similar regulations where somebody must be designated to, if necessary, turn the satellite off if there's a problem.
Okay, follow-up question. It's my experience with the university group is that they've got a lot of attention paid to the building of the satellite and the launching, and they get terribly excited. And then after 6 months, they lose interest and we never hear from them again. Is that the typical case? And then question about the AMSAT, is that a government operation or again, 6 guys down the street operating AMSAT?
Well, AMSAT is a not-for-profit organization. It was incorporated in Washington, D.C. So it started out as, I think, about 6 or 8 guys who incorporated AMSAT in 1969. but it is not a government entity. AMSAT does apply to get some of its satellites launched on free launches from NASA. Other launches, AMSAT is like any other entity. They write a check to somebody who's has a launch vehicle ready to take satellites into orbit. As for the universities, sometimes it's even less than that. The university project is to actually build and launch the satellite, and they honestly don't care if it operates. The students involved, the researchers, whoever at the university, their goal was to actually design and build and get a satellite launch. They didn't care if it actually transmitted. Now, some universities will collaborate with AMSAT and other groups to say, we have these, experiments we want to run. We're going to use the satellite for 6 to 12 months, 18 months. And when we're done, we will turn it over to you, to an amateur radio group, and you guys can use it for as long as it remains operational. Unfortunately, that's more of the minority when it comes to the university projects. But one university of sort project that went that way was a satellite for digital communications for, higher speed packet communications. It's called FalconSat, which was built for the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And the Air Force Academy used that satellite for over 15 years to help train their Air Force and now Space Force people on operating a satellite in orbit. It was launched so that it would pass over Colorado Springs several times a day. The satellite is slowly working its way to re-entering the atmosphere. The Air Force has since launched other satellites, and they turned FalconSat over to AMSAT to operate for the remainder of its life.
Got a couple questions. I'm sorry to interrupt. The one question is, what is the longest operating satellite in orbit now? Or does anyone know? And the second one is, how low on the horizon can you receive the satellite downlink or transmission or whatever you want to call it? Those are my questions.
Okay. Although there are some NASA satellites that I think have been in orbit since the late 60s that still transmit some sort of telemetry, I think in terms of two-way communications of any sort, the longest operating satellite in orbit is Oscar 7 that was launched in 1974. Its batteries failed in the early 80s. It started operating about 20 years ago just on solar power, and it's still operational today.
40.
So, that's like 40, 47 going on 48 years after its launch. Mark's been sitting there patiently. I see his hand up on the little.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We've got Tom, W6 UTC, or excuse me, we got Tom first, and then we'll go to Mark.
Okay.
So I was thinking, I was trying to track on the questions as well.
I don't see Tom on the little.
No, he had raised it earlier and then took it down. So I had him on the questions. It was in that it was Joe, then Tom, and then Mark on the order. Sorry.
Okay. That's all right.
So Tom, ETC.
I think he left, didn't he?
Oh, did he?
I don't see him here. I think he left.
I thought he left. Okay. Then we will go to Mark.
Morning, Mark.
Morning, and again, thank you. Great presentation. This is really, really fascinating, and I appreciate you distilling this for a novice like me to be able to understand it. And again, thank you, Kara and Endaf, for putting this together. I think probably a question, but I don't understand. I don't understand the statement when he said you might need to tune the uplink or downlink. What do you mean exactly by that?
Okay, that goes back to the Doppler effect that that makes the frequencies appear to change at the satellite in particular, because the satellite's moving. the satellites are designed like, I'll hold up my model again of AO91. This satellite is designed to listen on 435.250 megahertz in the 70 centimeter band. It transmits at 145.960 megahertz on the 2 meter band, that's where we listen to AO91. When AO91 comes up from the horizon, if you want the satellite to hear you, you're actually needing to transmit slightly below the nominal frequency. Typically on our FM radios, you would be transmitting at 435.240, about 10 kilohertz below the nominal uplink frequency. And as the satellite comes up from the horizon and gets to its highest point for your location, you'll need to tune your uplink transmit frequency to 435.245, then 250, then later on to 0.255 and 260 as the satellite is about to go below the horizon. We have to compensate because the satellite's unable to, try to listen to a wide spectrum and pick up the signal that's intended for it. FM receivers do have a bit of AFC, automatic frequency control, and that's good for a couple kilohertz. But for the wider range that we're tuning on the 70 centimeter band, we have to help it by adjusting our uplink frequency. And it's as simple as programming some memory channels and just stepping through the memory channels as the pass progresses.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And yeah, that's a great tip. You could program that in and just can dial it through. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And for those who have a more complicated stations, they want to use computer control, software can actually adjust those frequencies on the radio. So it's almost like working HF where you don't have to worry about the frequencies. The software will do the calculations for Doppler and control the radio. But for most people using handheld radios or dual band mobile radios, either the VFO or some memory channels and stepping through those frequencies, you can take care of the Doppler effect. With practice, it becomes second nature, but it's not that difficult. Was there another question?
Yeah, we had Tom. So W6ETC, if you're there. Yeah, you
Yes, I am.
All right.
It's a real quick question for
Sure.
Endaf. Endaf for iOS app. You indicated SAT, and I thought you said ComSat,
No, HamSat.
Hamsat.
HamSat, HAM.
Yes.
Okay, very good. That was my question. Thank you.
Again, app stores for whether it's the iOS devices or the Android devices or just a general search, Google, Yahoo, whatever, you can find, different apps and different programs. Again, some are free and some require a small payment to get the program. Should I go on, Albert?
Yes, I think we're clear and we can go ahead and continue. Thank you.
Okay. I've gone through operating. One facet of satellite operating, I mentioned at the start that I've lived in apartments and HOA controlled areas here in the Phoenix area in recent years. So I haven't been able to put up a proper home station to work satellites or for that matter, HF. In the apartment I lived in Phoenix, I could characterize the neighborhood as demilitarized zone, and I could have put an antenna up, but I didn't want to advertise to anybody, hey, I've got expensive radio gear in this apartment, come on up. So I would always go somewhere else to operate. But with the handheld radios or even a mobile radio and a battery along with an antenna, satellite operating is perfect for portable operating, getting away from home or even in your yard. If you can't put up an antenna, in my case, I either use a table or the top of a trash bin to put my equipment on, and that's my workspace for satellite operating. or with the handheld radio and antenna, you go just about anywhere. You know, other radios, I mentioned mobile radios. I also carry FT817s, a pair of them, so that I can work FM, single sideband, CW. I can carry my station in an old laptop bag, and for many, the portable station is just as functional and works about as well as some with a home station. With experience, with practice, you don't even have to announce that you're operating portable to the other stations. You're just another station on the satellite, and it doesn't matter that you're operating from a very portable setup instead of a home station with a couple of antennas on a mast or a tower. And in terms of satellite operating is not unlike working 6 meters or other terrestrial VHF, UHF activities, rare locations, generally defined by grid locator. Short trips are possible to go somewhere where you would be in a rare spot without having to fly off to some pile of rocks in the Pacific, or go off to the South Atlantic like the HF expeditions do. For a lot of satellite operators, even though we've had the FM satellites that can be used with handheld radios, the first one was launched in the early 90s. Many satellite operators just didn't bother with going out and operating away from home until the National Parks on the Air activity in 2016, when the ARRL had that program to help commemorate the centennial of the National Park Service. Satellite operators started looking at that and realized, hey, we can do this too. And for me, I operated from, I think it was 16 different national parks and monuments across Arizona, Southern Nevada, and up and down, mostly Northern California during 2016. And since then, satellite operators have also looked to do operating as part of Summits on the Air, the Parks on the Air that came after the ARRL event. Endaf has done some operating from U.S. islands around Southern California. U.S. islands is much more, generous in their definition of an island than the Islands on the Air, the IOTA program operated from the UK. With our equipment, you can take your radios with you, even if you're traveling to other countries. I've operated from Canada, from Mexico, and Australia, worked satellites from those places. Generally, the customs requirements are very simple. Unfortunately, Mexico is not an option now. They're not issuing permits to foreign hams, but when they were in the 2000s, even going to Mexico was simple for carrying the radios. But be ready. Law enforcement, authority figures, and even just the general population might be curious of what you're doing out there with a radio and pointing an antenna skyward, whether it's people thinking you're tracking aliens or you're tracking animals that have the transmitter collars. People may think that, and they almost never will think you're doing something with amateur radio satellites unless they know something about amateur radio. And when you're out operating somewhere, situational awareness, or what used to be called common sense, there may be times that you should not be operating. There may be some locations that it's best not to be out there with an antenna. But there are a lot of places that you can go and operate, and have fun doing it at the same time.
Can I just come in on the U.S. islands thing?
Sure.
So the U.S. islands thing, like Patrick says, it's a not really an awards program. It's just more like an operating program, and it's not sanctioned by the ARRL, they're very liberal in their definition. So other than the obvious island Catalina, I've operated from these other exotic islands, which is Naples Island, Terminal Island, Gilbert Island in Huntington Beach Harbor, Trinidad Island, which is in Huntington Beach Harbor, and Lido Island. I've not had the pleasure yet of operating from Balboa. So those are kind of the exotic islands I've operated from locally here.
And over here in Phoenix, it's called an island, but it's just a high spot in the middle of the normally dry Salt River. There are bridges that connect this so-called island to both banks of the river, just a few minutes southeast of me. I've gone over there and worked Endaf when he's been on, some of those islands.
We did an island from Turtle Island to your.
I don't even remember the name of it because I don't consider it an island, but for U.S. islands it is. So I've gone over there and I've operated, and I even wrote down the island designator so that way I could, do a proper exchange with Endaf. But there are all sorts of operating activities, and satellite operating can be brought alongside HF operations, because the satellite operations with the apps and the programs, when the satellites will be available to you. So you can schedule those times to work satellites, and then in between passes, you can do HF or 6 meters or other radio stuff. So you can be doing more than just satellites if you're going out to someplace. For me, my first attempt at operating away from home, I went to the Dayton Hamvention for my first time in 2006. I went with my then father-in-law, and I took, I still have the radio I used, an old ICOM ICW32. Instead of the ducky antenna, I put a longer telescoping whip on it, and we drove around the Dayton area, went to the Indiana-Ohio state line, and I was operating from different places. I didn't take an arrow or an elk antenna or some other directional antenna, but I was able to make some contacts with the satellites we had at the time. And in this particular location, I was standing northeast of Dayton on a spot where 4 grids come together, which is, like on 6 meters or other bands, the grid locator seems to be the coin of the realm for most satellite operators. And I was able to hand out 4 grids with each contact I made at this spot. A couple months ago, Endaf invited me over to California. So went over to meet up with him in Long Beach, and we drove past the town of Trona on the northern end of the Mojave Desert. He wanted to operate from the DM15, DM16 grid line, which is, not even the phones worked out there. So that this could certainly qualify as a middle of nowhere location. This was on
Twitter.
What was that, Endaf?
I couldn't even get online to get on Twitter.
No, we were in a dead spot for our mobile phones on different carriers. Maybe Verizon would have worked out there, but it was actually fun to be away from online, and we were just out operating. We did some sightseeing in that area. And this particular shot, Endaf was using his Kenwood dual band mobile radio, a TM V71. It's inside the black case in the foreground. He's holding an elk dual band log periodic. And this was an afternoon pass. He was working the PO 101 satellite. And you see his, the front end of his truck is parked in the background on the, the left side of the picture. We used a GPS to make sure we were set up on the grid line. At that spot, it would have been 36 degrees north exactly. Endaf worked a bunch of passes. I worked a couple passes, handing out grids that are not normally heard on satellites. This was Endaf's alternate operating position. The same radio setup, but with a shaded fold-up chair out in the desert up there. Like I said, it was a fun trip. We had talked about this. COVID got in the way of actually doing this, of both of us doing this trip. But last December, we made it happen. We even worked each other from this spot. He had his radio. I had my ICOM handheld with another antenna, just like him, an elk antenna. and we both made contact standing on that grid line, so we would be in each other's log from that spot. I think we were separated by what, maybe 20, 30 yards of not.
Yeah, about 10 meters, yeah.
We could see each other, but we were listening to ourselves through the satellite that was up about 400 to 500 miles in orbit.
So I was able to log that grid into my log for my VUCC location, which was out there.
Yeah, that's one way to get a grid into your logbook. Invite a friend, invite another operator along.
The rules say there's nothing in the rules against it.
There's nothing in the rules that says that, if you can see the other station, it doesn't count. We both made sure we were only hearing the satellite downlink, even though if we listened on the uplink, we could have unplugged our antennas and heard each other at that short distance. But we were listening to each other through the satellite that was a few hundred miles away. Pre-COVID, Endaf and I participated in some amateur radio demonstrations on the deck of the Queen Mary for satellite operating. Now, the Queen Mary used to have a full satellite station, including long Yagis mounted above the wireless room. Those were taken down a few years ago, but we'd done 3 demonstrations at the end of 2018 and in 2019 from different decks on the Queen Mary. This was during Memorial Day in 2019. We were on for the 3-day holiday weekend. In this case, Endaf is using, he's holding an Elenco DJ G7T, a tri-band handheld radio. And if you look closely on the antenna, it looks like there's 2 antennas there. There's this elk log periodic, but also strapped onto it is a 1.2 gigahertz Yagi, a small 10-element Yagi. And AO92 had a mode where you could transmit up on 1.2 gigahertz, and the downlink was on 2 meters. And we were operating that from the Queen Mary using the W6RO call. And we both took turns working different passes from the deck during that holiday weekend. The ship crew was dressed up in costumes and uniforms from the wartime, from World War II, and there was even a Winston Churchill look-alike on the deck. Came by and visited us. A few weekends ago, I went to one spot that, at least among VHF operators generally, is considered rather rare. In southern Arizona, we have a grid DM31, and most of it is actually in Mexico. The northeast corner of the grid comes up around the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. It's about a 2.5-hour or so drive from Phoenix. I drove down there. During the day, I went inside the visitor center and got the National Park Service stamp to show that I was there on January 22nd. And I just parked near the visitor center and set up the radios on the roof of the car. Off my left shoulder is my single sideband setup I use as a Yaesu FT817 to transmit. And next to it is an ICOM ICR30 wideband receiver for the satellite downlinks. And then over to the right is an ICOM dual band mobile radio, the ID5100. I just set up at the visitor center because I didn't want to park out in a remote part of this national monument that's right up against the Mexican border. And as it was, I was visited by either the park rangers, and the Border Patrol drove by once, and this time they didn't stop, but sometimes they'll all stop and ask, "What you doing?" And once I assure them that I can't listen to their digital radio systems and I'm not tracking animals in a national monument, they go away. They're just they're satisfied that I'm not doing anything unusual. I'm not having to set up anything and, for example, nail spikes into the ground or tie anything to a cactus or a tree. It's pretty much I'm operating stuff that I'm holding or it's sitting on my car. So unlike some who go to national parks to work HF and they might get hassled about the need to erect a larger antenna, once I answer the basic questions that I almost always get asked, there was no big deal. They left me alone. I was self-contained. and I didn't have to, mount anything into the ground or onto a tree or a cactus. All was good. And I have a couple pictures. I actually included the next couple of slides in a presentation I gave last month at the Hamcation in Orlando. And when I put the next slide up on the screen, before I could get a word out to that crowd, they all started laughing. And Endaf will know this when he sees the slide.
Oh,
A few years ago, there was a satellite operator visiting, I think it was his daughter at the University of West Virginia. And he happened to park at a Walmart store that sat on a grid boundary and operated from there. And over a couple of weeks, satellite operators mostly on Twitter started talking about, well, why don't we do our own little on the air event, sort of like national parks on the air, but at Walmart stores. So it came up with a whole series of interesting rules, points and bonuses based on making contacts from Walmart. Is the Walmart store on a grid boundary? When you were there, did you buy the components to make an antenna and actually use it at the Walmart? Did you operate, I think Endaf, you were in a shopping cart.
yeah, I was mobile. I was standing inside a shopping cart, so sitting in the shopping cart making a contact. So I got some extra points because I was shopping cart mobile.
And there were points where if you went inside to get something to eat from the Walmart, if you were there with a dog, a nod to the old Roy line of dog food and dog snacks that are sold in Walmart. The first of these activities was in April of 2018, and I used the store locator on the Walmart website to plot out a few stores that I could visit in the span of a few hours. And I started at, a location in, east of downtown Phoenix. It's near the middle of the map on this slide. And after I made some contacts on one pass from that store, I drove north and operated from 2 more stores in Phoenix, and then swung around a freeway and operated from stores in Scottsdale and Mesa, and also on an Indian reservation next to Scottsdale. I would work one pass, make some contacts, move along. And this particular route, this was in the span of about 5 hours. Taking advantage of freeways and, the stores being sometimes, toward the end of my drive, they were separated by 2 miles. So it was real easy to work one pass, move down the road a couple miles and set up for the next pass. Now, others were doing that too. Endaf did some of that around Southern California. He had mapped out a few stores he operated from and, did, sit in the shopping cart for some, and others he was just in the parking lot operating.
Yeah, I went to here in Long Beach, Carson, Downey, Torrance. I think about 6 over the weekend. And nobody pays any attention to you because you're on Walmart, right? Nobody pays any attention to what you're doing. You don't look weird at all.
And especially considering many Walmarts, there are people who will park in the parking lot overnight. They have their RV or the camper shell on their truck. And, there are some Walmarts here that don't allow overnight parking. There's one location on an Indian reservation. They actually have signs, no overnight parking permitted, and they will enforce that. But most of the Walmarts, at least here in the Phoenix area, you can always find some RVs parked out in the lot. Maybe they're not trying to find an RV park or campground. That they're self-contained, so a Walmart parking lot's fine. This was the first year in 2018. There was a second Walmart parking lot on the air event the next year in 2019, and this time, instead of limiting my operating to just 5 hours, I planned out a day, at least the daylight hours. Went back to the Walmart store locator and found some more stores and lined them up with satellite passes. This is in the southeast part of the Metro Phoenix area. And again, I started out in a section where, in the middle of the map where there's a Walmart store, those first 4 stops are separated by 2 miles. So work one satellite pass, drive 2 miles for the next one, 2 miles, you know. And later in the day, I started driving further because I had more time between satellite passes. And for the second event, you know, I operated FM, single sideband, and even packet through that Falcon Sat 3 satellite, the one that used to be operated by the Air Force Academy. I operated from 13 different parking lots representing 14 stores, because the last stop I made in the lower right corner of the map, there was a Walmart and a Sam's Club in the same shopping mall. One of the few Sam's Clubs still remaining in the Phoenix area. But you know, the maps on these two slides, I was using APRS, and that you know, showed where I was going and where I had operated, and then I could overlay labels showing the different store numbers and the satellites I used at each location. This was about 10 hours of operating, and you know, being in July of 2019, it was hot. I was burning fuel to keep the air conditioner going between passes as the day went on. But it was fun to, you know, this is probably an extreme form of portable operating where you're picking up and moving one pass after another, as opposed to staying in one spot like in a park or a national park or on an island and operate for hours at a time or days at a time. But again, the satellite operators enjoyed this. COVID, I think, got in the way for 2020 and 2021. I don't know if there are any plans to dust this off and try it again, you know, now that we're getting away from the worst of the pandemic. But you know, this is just having fun, and something that came, you know, a lot of people talking, you know, rules developed by committee for all the different bonuses and the points you could earn. Just a lot of fun while making contacts. That's the end of my slideshow. I'm looking at my watch. It's just past 9 o'clock for all of you. Lots of time for questions. Albert, I'm going to take down the slideshow, and we'll just, you know, we can do Q&A.
That sounds good. So I had one question, and that would be on the chatter that you see for the kind of different opportunities there. What are the social media groups that you would recommend if somebody was getting started and wanted to connect and see these events and kind of get involved? Because that would be like a field day type activity where they could have a lot of opportunity to listen and to hear.
Well, field days, usually the different clubs and organizations that do field days, many of them will indicate if they have a satellite station. I don't know about you, Endaf, but you know, probably in the next few weeks I'll start getting emails or phone calls from people locally inviting me to join their club for field day to get the 100-point bonus.
Yeah, I'm not as famous as you, but I work with a Long Beach club, so that's who I predominantly work with for the 100 bonus points. Although I have in the past been asked by the Orange County club did their winter field day in the early days, and I would go down and help them get their 100 bonus points to satellite.
Okay, but what about the Walmart's parking lots on the air?
The Walmart parking lot, that was developed over Twitter among different satellite operators.
Okay.
For example, my Twitter feed is public, and you don't need to be on Twitter to see it. If you go to twitter.com/WD9EWK, you can see, you know, anything that I've written there. I post pictures and sometimes maps when I've gone out and operated, you know, when I go out to different places. Endaf does a lot of the same thing.
Okay.
But you know, our Twitter feeds are open to the public to view. And again, you don't actually have to be on Twitter. AMSAT has a Twitter feed where there will be announcements of upcoming operations in different places. Excuse me. And
All
I'm
right.
seeing a couple questions that one of them was sent to me directly. And
Okay.
I'll take this from Don, WA6 GBI in Seal Beach. Older equipment, a Yaesu FT 736R, if it's set up for satellite operating, it is still a viable radio. Although I've heard some people tell me, based on eBay pricing, they would probably sell the 736R, especially if they have some other bands in it, and go buy an IC 9700 and still have money left over. Given how eBay inflation has gone over the years on used amateur equipment. But there are people who still like the older radios, maybe because they have knobs and buttons and not so much stuff buried in menus.
All right. And then we have Mary Jane and Bob. So let's go to Mary Jane's question. So she says, I know very little about this. You mentioned using a GPS to locate the grids. What type of GPS device is this?
It can be really any type of GPS. I know that Garmin GPS receivers, even the smaller, less expensive eTrex units, you can display your location in latitude and longitude or in the Maidenhead grid locator that hams use. So you can put it into the Maidenhead mode and it'll show a grid locator. Like for my house here in Scottsdale, it would be DM43BL, or was it DM03VV for you, Endaf, at your home in Long Beach?
Yeah, I'm in Delta Mike 03 Victor Victor. So Delta Mike 03 pretty much covers the Long Beach area, Lakewood, Bellflower, Torrance, the South Bay area. And then Orange County is predominantly Delta Mike 13. Catalina Island is in Delta Mike 03 because I would say 80% of Delta Mike 03 is the Pacific Ocean. So it's a rare grid square. Well, it was back in the day before I came along, but apparently DMO3 is very rare. Even though
it was rare because, like you said, Endaf, there's not much land in it. I was in Los Angeles for a presentation in 2015, and I posted another source of information among satellite operators is the mailing list called the AMSAT BB that's operated by AMSAT. And I posted on there, a message saying, I'm giving a talk in Los Angeles. Are there any grids around Los Angeles that, any of you need for contact via satellite? And I got one response, and it was DM03. It was, grid, where Endaf lives. I ended up, after my presentation, driving to Dockweiler State Beach on the waterfront west of LAX, and I operated from there for a couple of hours. I never would have thought that a rare grid expedition would have me in the second largest city in America, but I didn't have to drive out to the Mojave or to the Imperial Valley. I just had to drive to the waterfront near LAX.
I'll add to this quickly. If you don't have a GPS device, I use my Kenwood radio has a GPS built in, and it'll display your lat long and also your Maidenhead grid. But you can also, there's an app on iOS anyway called Maidenhead. I don't think my camera's picking it up.
I'll put it in the chat.
It's called Maidenhead, and it'll use your phone's GPS. It'll show you a map of where you are, and it'll give you your Maidenhead grid square. So right now I'm sitting in DMO3 Victor Victor 60, and it'll also give my latitude and longitude. And it's accurate to about 5 meters. So I mean, there's plenty of ways you can find out where you are.
And even the satellite tracking programs on phones and tablets can make use of the GPS inside the device. So rather than entering your location, manually entering your latitude or longitude into those tracking apps, you can usually access a function that says use GPS, and it will load your location into those apps. So that you don't need to carry a separate GPS. I usually do because many of the handheld GPS receivers, whether it's Garmin or the other manufacturers, can usually show your location to a higher degree of accuracy than the GPS modules in the mobile phones, tablets, and even some of our radios like Kenwood and Yaesu have that have GPS modules in them.
Yeah, so is that app Endaf the Maidenhead converter?
No, it's just called Maidenhead, I believe.
Okay.
Let me look in the iOS store.
Okay.
And I'm going to do a quick search. There are similar apps on the Android side of the world too.
Yeah, you're right, Albert. It's Maidenhead Converter is the actual name of the app. You're right.
Okay. And then for those Android users, if we could post it in the chat as well. So we want to be fair, fair and balanced for Android and iOS.
What about Windows Phone?
Yeah, what was the other one?
I just found one. Easy QTH locator will take the GPS in your phone or tablet, and it will also display your grid locator and your latitude and longitude. And there's others. You could search for Maidenhead grid locator in either app store, and there's probably a few different apps available that will just that, or it's a function in the satellite tracking apps that you can get from those app stores. And I think one of the questions I must have, I overlooked it. It was like how low or how close to the horizon that you can work satellites. That's basically determined by your surroundings. If you're out in the middle of where we were in December up north of Trona, other than the mountains that were around us, we could basically work to the horizon in certain directions. You go out to other parts of the desert, you can certainly work the satellites right down to the horizon, right to the moment that they go below the horizon is that will be it for the pass. It all depends on your surroundings. You can, in my backyard, I usually give up a few degrees above the horizon due to the other houses around me. One of my neighbors has I guess it's a guest house built in her backyard, and every bit of her rooftop facing south is covered with solar panels. So it's kind of a noisy place to operate. So I can go in my front yard and I can operate a little closer to the horizon with fewer surroundings getting in the way.
So quickly, as up in Signal Hill, I've gotten down to low as about 4 degrees because I'm obviously higher up. And those of you who know Cyprus, those of you know where Cottonwood Church is off Catella, they have that big, large parking lot.
Yes.
I did work one pass, which was about 6 or 7 degrees above the horizon to me as it was traveling north, as it came away from the building. And I was able to get a guy over in Vermont. That's the reason I was there, to get him. So, I mean, the higher the better, but it's not impossible. Like Patrick says, it all depends what's really around you.
All right. And then we also have Bob. So sorry,
Yes.
go ahead, Bob.
Thank you. My question is, does this slide presentation, can I get a copy of that, please?
Yes. So I'm recording this, and when we're done here, I will distribute that to our email distribution and also make it available on our Cara Facebook group. And then I will share the PDF once I get that as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And, I think I might have your email. Endaf forwarded me the Zoom invitation. Who's that?
AC Gonzo.
Okay, yeah, it is
@gmail.com.
you, Albert. I
Yeah.
have your email address. So what I'll do when we're done here is I'll send Endaf and you, Albert, the PDF version of the slideshow, and if you can put that in your Facebook group or somewhere else that members can grab it, that's fine. Or email me directly. I suppose you could email Endaf as well. We'll have copies of it, and we can also email it directly to those interested.
I'll thank you for the very fine presentation.
You're welcome. Happy to be on a lot of clubs, it's evening meetings, which I can do. When Endaf said this would be an an 8 o'clock meeting, first of all, I made sure that we were speaking on, was it Pacific time or Mountain time? And, here we are on
Mhm.
Saturday morning. Most clubs here, it's usually like a Wednesday night or a Thursday night meeting. I don't think there are any that do a Saturday morning other than a breakfast at a restaurant if they've gone back to doing those things.
Well, I'm certainly awake at 8 o'clock. The dog wakes me up at 4:30 or 5.
Well, you may have heard, I don't know if you saw, I had my dog was on the bed behind me when I started this. She was laying quietly, so I left her alone, and I wasn't paying attention. She did leave the room. Funny thing, when I'm out in the yard doing radio, if I'm using a voice mode, she doesn't want to be out in the yard with me. But if I'm doing digital stuff, I pack it, she'll be out with me, and I can, I can pet her, and she can run around, patrol the yard while I'm doing things. But if I'm using the microphone, she has little interest in hanging out with me.
Yeah, that's like my family too. They don't want to hear the chatter. So.
Well, when I had a home station about 20 years ago, I gravitated toward the digital modes. 20 years ago, it'd be RIDI and PSK 31, and that worked well for me. I didn't mind. My CW wasn't great. I hadn't gone to using a paddle instead of a straight key. Had I learned to use a paddle earlier, maybe I'd have a different view of that mode. With that said, even on the satellites, there are times, I've done some straight key nights on satellites in the past through our satellites that are capable of single sideband or CW operations.
The new craze now is FT4 on satellite. That's the new craze.
Yes, there are people who will do FT4, not with a handheld radio like you've seen pictured in the slideshow. They're using home stations with computer control, and they're running the WSJT software. But there are people who will do FT4 at lower power levels, hopefully, through some of our satellites. Just like working FT4 on HF or on VHF, UHF modes, bands terrestrially, except it's through the satellite, and their computer is adjusting the frequencies to compensate for Doppler in between transmissions.
And about 6 years ago, using AO85, there was something called Experimenters Wednesday, which is an FM, or was an FM satellite, slow scan television. So you can do more on a satellite and just use your phone.
Yeah, that's great. So what do you see in the next few years on the direction for satellites, and kind of what are the trends that we'll be seeing?
Well, the trends are the challenges are coming not so much, with, the equipment and how we operate, but how we get our satellites in orbit. There's so much stuff in orbit, not just space junk, but just so many satellites. Think of every time SpaceX launches those Starlink satellites for Elon Musk's wireless internet, he's launching dozens at a time. And he's launching those satellites into the lower orbits that we also use, for mini amateur radio satellites. It's getting congested. The FCC here in the US is, they play a big hand in satellites getting to orbit. If the satellite is licensed and operated by an entity here in the US, you have to have an FCC license, whether it's an amateur radio satellite or those Starlink satellites or satellites built by universities. The FCC is like the gatekeeper of getting a satellite into orbit and operational. They have proposed some regulations that would essentially limit amateur radio satellites launched by universities to very low orbits at the International Space Station or lower. At those orbits, the satellites will normally re-enter in 1 to 2 years after launch. One thing that the amateur radio groups will probably need to do much more of is instead of having our own 4-inch cubes or other other frames with our own satellites is having these satellites, turn into payloads bolted onto other satellites or incorporated into other satellites. Let those operators deal with the licensing to get the satellite into orbit. The amateur radio payload, will have the appropriate amateur radio licensing. We may see more of that in the future. Over Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, there's an amateur radio transponder on a communication satellite at geostationary orbit. It's called QO100. Now, that satellite stays over the same part of the world all the time. If you have to either be in the easternmost part of Brazil and South America, or Europe, Africa, much of Asia, to use that satellite. So from here in the US, we can listen in using these web receivers, these web SDR receivers in other parts of the world, but we can't operate directly. Endaf put the link in the chat. That's it. Is that a video stream from this?
No, that's a web SDR, the narrowband portion of the satellite. It's a commercial satellite that beams direct to home television for the Middle East. Somehow AMSAT to Germany, I think it was, were able to get a small portion of the transponder for amateur radio use. They have a narrowband portion, which is for voice on single sideband and some data modes. And they also have a wideband portion for digital amateur television. And then every Thursday night, they have a net at 12 o'clock our time here locally. But the footprint, like Patrick says, doesn't really cover us out here in the western part of North America. But you can listen in and watch online through the British Amateur Television Club. They have a web SDR listing.
There are some people who have said that, if they go to the Marconi station on Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland, in the easternmost part of Canada, even though the footprint maps don't show Newfoundland in the footprint of QO100, it might just be close enough. I don't think anybody has actually attempted it, certainly not successfully used it, but they keep talking about that, because other than Newfoundland, there's really no part of North America that's in the footprint of that satellite. And AMSAT was hoping to have a similar payload on a US government satellite a few years ago, where the payload would be, a partnership with AMSAT and Virginia Tech, riding on a US Air Force satellite parked over North and South America. But the US government, shelved that project. There's no ETA for it coming back, if at all. So we're sort of on the sideline for a really high orbit satellite. And to launch to a geostationary orbit, there are no free launches to that orbit, and it's expensive, not just for the launch, but the licensing to get a spot at that special orbit. You still have another question, Bob? Your hand
Yes,
is...
I do.
Bob's up. Yep.
Yes, I do. I was wondering, is anyone listening now or watching going to be demonstrating a satellite communication operation? I'd like to watch if possible, since I'm brand new at this.
Well, I'm actually not set up to do a live presentation here.
Yeah.
But what I'm going to do is I recorded Endaf operating out by Trona a couple months ago. That picture that I had in the slideshow came from, if you can see the chat window, I've just put a link to a video where Endaf was working that pass on the PO101 satellite, out past Trona. Now I just recorded it with my mobile phone. He was working the passes. It was the only pass that I got a video of out there, because I was either just watching him or there was a pass where he was working AO91 and FM, and I was working another satellite in single sideband. We were on different frequencies, so
secretly want to escape from the prison of fat.
we weren't interfering with each other, but it was sort of like an HF expedition with multiple stations. He was handling one crowd on AO91. I was handling crowds on other satellites. We worked the one pass, the same pass together, so we could get in each other's logs. And I think both of us worked everybody else that showed up on the pass. But that's an example of Endaf using his portable station out in the desert a couple months ago. And there are lots of videos. My YouTube channel, I don't like calling it a channel, but that's YouTube nomenclature. My YouTube channel, that didn't show up as a link, but I'll make it so. Some of my videos are either of me or of other operators working satellite passes with their stations. That shows up as a link now. I've uploaded videos. A friend of ours from Southern California was out at the Hamfest in Yuma a few weekends ago, and I posted a video of Dave 87BB working SO50 from the Yuma Hamfest, from the fairgrounds that the Hamfest was held at.
And if you want to hear what's going on, even with a handheld and a good rubber duck antenna like a Diamond or a Comet, just go outside when AO91 is above Southern California and listen on 145.960. You can hear what's going on.
Just open the squelcher, hold the monitor button so that you're hearing the static rush.
And you may need to, angle the radio, as it goes over you.
I wanted to get back,
Thanks.
we were talking about other modes, FT4 and that. There are a lot of Kenwood and some Yaesu radios that have APRS functionality built into them. This is a Kenwood THD72. You can use the APRS functionality through a digipeater, like on the ISS, to exchange messages between stations that essentially are contacts. An APRS message is a directed transmission to another station. So it has, for example, my call sign is the sender, and I could send a message to N6 UTC, and Endaf would receive it on his radio, and then he could reply to me with, we usually put our grid locator, or maybe we'll also mention our location if we're on an island or some other special spot, but we're using APRS messages to make contacts, because these radios, they're designed with the APRS functionality, but not a full keyboard where we could just type in free form like you would on, say, PSK31 or RIDI, where hi Endaf, I am at DM43 QSL, and Endaf could type on a full keyboard back to me. So we're using messages that we've loaded into our radios in advance. So we're not having to type, these keypads are just like the old flip phones where you'd have to push the buttons multiple times to get a letter or number out. So instead of doing that, we preload some messages in the radios and can call them up.
And some of my messages,
contact.
Some of my messages I preloaded into my radio are in the Welsh language, so I like to confuse a lot of people.
So yeah, like the Kenwood THD72 I was holding up is a popular radio for both FM satellites and packet digipeaters on satellites. Kenwood had the THD7 and the THD74, which all those radios are now discontinued. Yaesu was even the FT1 DR didn't that support messaging, Endaf?
The FT1, the FT2, the FT3, and the FT5.
Yeah, and then some mobile radios from those manufacturers. There are certain Anytone DMR radios that have some APRS functions in them, except for maybe the latest model of the Anytone 878 handheld. It was usually just enough to squawk your location. It couldn't receive anything and display it on the radio. That was mainly just so you could see yourself on an APRS map. But the Kenwood and the Yaesu radios were designed to do more with APRS. including the messaging. I think the Kenwood radios are slightly easier to use for messaging than the Yaesus, but
Yep.
but both radios are viable options.
So speaking
So-
speaking as a civilian, yeah, speaking as a civilian right now, the Kenwood THD 72 is my favorite handheld radio for that application.
I was going to say for beginning operators, when they get into maybe a popular satellite that's coming over, is it hard to get in there and get your like timing as to when you're supposed to be calling out?
Well, that's why that can be a difficult thing at first. That's why, rather than just trying to announce your call sign, it might be good, just to take some time and listen. Don't worry about transmitting. Just listen to how the exchanges take place. Now, there are passes where you'll hear 3, 4, 5, 6 stations. They just announce their call sign. One, rapid fire succession. Nobody's calling anybody else. But if you're listening, you hear those call signs, and especially if you hear somebody who's actually making contacts, maybe, a call to that station would be in order. And then, like I said, if you haven't been on satellites before and your call sign is heard, whether it's the home station operator who's looked up in his logbook and says, I don't see N6ACG in my log, I should call him. Or maybe they have a working, in memory, they have a working knowledge of call signs that regularly show up. It'll be like fresh meat. All the other operators will start to call the new operator once the new operator has made a contact or two. And most regular operators will recognize if someone new is coming on. They'll slow down their speaking, to make sure that they're speaking clearly for the new operator. Now, if Endaf and I are on a busy pass, we'll both speak to each other quickly. Sometimes approaching the old Federal Express commercial of just trying to make a quick contact in a matter of a few seconds.
There are times when we've even ignored each other because there's a big pile up there.
Yeah, we'll both hear each other, but okay, Endaf's at his house in Long Beach. I'm here in Scottsdale. We've worked each other from these same spots
A million times.
lots of times, different satellites, different modes, FM, single sideband, packet, and like I had on the one slide, we've even used D-Star on AO27, which we did a lot of during 2021. We would make time to actually do D-Star digital voice. If you look up on my QRZ.com page, I have links to videos of one of those passes in March of last year, where Endaf was running a video on his end and I was on my end, and you can hear the audio. The audio was pretty good. It was similar to what you would hear through a D-Star repeater, or if you were using a hotspot in D-Star, except it was through a satellite 500 miles overhead.
Hey, Endaf, what was that favorite radio you were just talking about?
Oh, the Kenwood THD 72. It's
HD 72. Okay.
it's no longer manufactured, but you probably still find them some places.
THD 72.
Correct.
Correct. Okay.
I just typed it into the chat window. It's
Okay.
a very, very good radio for FM and packet satellites. It's capable of full duplex operating, but plug an earphone or a headset or something into it so
Okay.
that when you transmit, the speaker doesn't feed into the microphone on the front of the radio and cause a feedback squeal. I have a spreadsheet with radios that are known to be good for satellite operating, for full duplex operation. Again, on my QRZ page, I add to that as I become aware of newer or different radios. I've actually been able to go back and put older radios that were made in the 90s and the 2000s. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar enough with most of the radios that were made by Standard in those times. There are a few of those that were also good for FM satellites back then. But Standard, you know, as a brand, it's gone from amateur radio. It may still exist. Does it still exist at all in the marine side of the world, Endaf?
What's that? I'm sorry.
The Standard brand?
Standard Horizon. The Standard itself no longer exists, but the marine brand now is Standard Horizon.
Okay. So, but those, but the spreadsheet I have there, ICOM, Kenwood, Yaesu, Samalenko, a few of the Chinese brands, like Wuxon and TYT for a mobile radio. I haven't looked, deeply into the Chinese brands, because usually I don't get loaner radios. I don't, I'm not one of these guys that has the YouTube. They do a lot of live YouTube stuff. And sometimes they are lucky enough to get, samples of radios sent to them to try out and promote. So when I've tried something out, it's a radio I've either borrowed or a radio I've purchased. And, unlike with the handheld radios, if I wanted to start trying the mobile radios, that can be expensive real fast. I think my dog was trying to tell me something from down the hall.
All right.
Oh,
Oh,
there's my greyhound. Her name is Valley.
very nice.
Maybe I'll keep her from, I think she wants me to walk her, and she'll get her walk in a little while, but she's got to be patient with me for a little longer.
Yeah, I've got a couple of huskies that don't have patience in their vocabulary.
Oh, Huskies don't. They're very stubborn.
Yes.
Did
Very
you know
chat.
the Husky has been reported to be one of the, or maybe the most
I'll be
dog
right back.
Okay.
dogs that get away most of the time?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Escape artists. Oh, yeah.
escape artists. Oh, they are.
Yeah. Mine likes to so I have two. One of them likes to open doors and just escape, and not necessarily like one of the wall crawlers, but definitely in opening doors, getting through screens, getting anywhere that he wants to. And the other one likes to dig. So when she follows the other one out, she likes to dig, huge holes in the yard, which I get to fill in. So why don't I go ahead and stop the recording now? I think we're at a good spot here.